direction. So effectively now the pivot is at the edge of the object over here. And if we go in the opposite direction, I'll do -50. You can see it'll actually move in the opposite direction, and now the pivot is at the edge of the object here instead. So you have the option, you know, if you want to actually offset the pivot on each shape. Now, another issue can be a render time issue, and that is if you've obviously done a lot of rendering, you'll know that when you have two polygons in exactly the same space in a scene, rounding errors in floating point maths can mean that on one frame of the animation, say surface A will be deemed to be in front and surface B behind, and then on the following frame of the animation, a slight change in the floating point values may mean that it now thinks that the opposite has happened. And if this happens on a frame-to-frame basis, this can produce a really bad flickering. You can actually see kind of what I'm talking about here in the viewport, where these shapes are pretty much intersecting the surface of the teapot, and you can see it's actually producing this pretty horrible pattern. If I play the animation through, you can see it's updating from frame to frame, and you can see this pattern is looking pretty awful. Well, you know, viewport accuracy is actually a lot less than render time accuracy, and it just basically highlights this problem. So to avoid this coplanar issue, you have three options here, one of which only becomes available, I believe it's when you have align to surface turned off. The first one is surface offset, and that's very simply an offset of the patch along the normal away from the surface. So if we do let's say 0.3 and wait for the update, there you go. You can see it's actually got a little bit better now. The yellow patches are actually sitting a little bit more proud of the surface, and you've only got a little bit of the blue coming through. I'll go for 0.9 and wait for it to update. There we go, and you can see it's a lot better now. So this sort of value you would tweak. You can actually see here though it's actually starting to get quite far away from the surface here, so you've got to be careful and, you know, tweak around with that value and make sure you get the best sort of value that you would want. Now in the viewport, as I said, the accuracy isn't great, so I'm using quite a large surface offset here, you know, 0.9. The default value is 0.1, and that probably gives you a better indication of what you want at render time. If I do a quick render of that, let's just transform the vertices, doing the simulation, and it's done a render, and you can see you aren't getting any intersection artifacts in the render. So the value of 0.1 is probably enough. If at render time you're getting artifacts, just increase that value. Now another intersection issue can be when you have multiple patches that overlap, and you can get the same issue with those. So what you can do is you can actually give this surface offset some variation. So each patch will be at a slightly different height above the surface, and that's great as well. That again can get rid of any sort of flickering issues that you may have with overlapping patches. So that's quite a useful feature there. And the last option you can see is vertex jitter, and this option only becomes available when continuous update is turned off. Obviously that's something which you wouldn't necessarily want to do generally, but there is a very good reason for that. What this vertex jitter does is it will actually take the mesh, and based on the vertices of the mesh that it's actually based on, it'll as you can imagine by the name, it'll jitter the vertices in world space around, and that can actually get the vertices so that they don't align up with the underlying vertices, and again that can stop any sort of alignment problems that you might have. Now the problem with vertex jitter would be that if you had a continuous update and you jittered on every update, that random jittering would cause your patch to wobble and flutter and you know, basically twitch around like some I don't know, horrible beast, and that's not exactly the sort of thing that you want in your simulation. So vertex jitter only works on a static mesh. It's probably useful generally, you know, on static surfaces, but again, it's another option for getting rid of any sort of issues that you're having with the patches interpenetrating with the surfaces. Okay, so that's it for the shape mark operator.